Welcome, everyone. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will now come to order. Our subcommittee's meeting today to hear testimony on environmental justice for coastal communities, examining inequities in federal grant making. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at this hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will help us hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedule. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. And hearing no objections, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. So please mute yourself when you do not intend to be heard. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing any technical problems should inform committee staff immediately, and we will try to take care of it. So let's get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the subcommittee's oversight hearing today on environmental justice issues within the federal grant-making process. Our country's gone through a massive reckoning with structural racism this year, and I believe this is a moment that calls on all of us to really listen, do some soul searching, and try to think about how we can do our part to remedy institutional and structural racism and injustice. So here in this subcommittee, I believe that should include examining the laws, programs, and grants within our jurisdiction to see whether they are providing equal opportunities and benefits for communities of color, and whether they might be directly or indirectly contributing to problems of racial inequity. For today's hearing, we're specifically looking at NOAA's grants and programs that help build resilient coastal ecosystems and communities. We'll use this hearing to discuss potential improvements to ensure that all communities have access to this federal support. This is especially critical because so many Americans are experiencing unprecedented changes on our nation's coast due to climate change, and these impacts are falling disproportionately on communities of color. 2020 has been yet another historic year for hurricanes and coastal storms. Scientists tell us that we are going to see more of this. There'll be more frequent and intense extreme weather events. Because of sea level rise and extreme storms, we're seeing more frequent chronic flooding issues resulting in damage to homes and businesses, preventing people from getting to work and school. Nutrient runoff and changing ocean conditions are severely degrading coastal ecosystems such as salt marshes and seagrass beds, which protect coastal communities and their economies. And ocean heat waves are having devastating impacts on fisheries and important coastal ecosystems, including here on the West Coast, our kelp forests. As state and local budgets have been hit hard by this pandemic, many states are being forced to gut their coastal resiliency budgets. And so federal support for these programs that restore and protect our coastlines and ecosystems is especially important right now. And that's why this equity conversation is also very important. Unfortunately, many federal grants go to wealthier communities, while under-resourced communities, often the ones who need the assistance most, are overlooked or ineligible. I'll give you an example of that. After Superstorm Sandy, wealthier neighborhoods got more and faster assistance than their less affluent neighbors. So people were able to move back home, get their economies going, and bounce back quicker. And over the past 2 years of this subcommittee, as we've examined legislation, we've heard examples from stakeholders about how the barriers that under-resourced communities face are getting in the way of their ability to access federal assistance. Sometimes it's grant writing capacity. A community can't afford a professional project planning team that could take a good technical idea and turn it into a competitive grant application. Other times it's money for matching funds. A community can't pull together enough non-federal matching money to even qualify for a grant. obviously that renders them ineligible. And in some cases, certain communities are just categorically ineligible. We've heard about this last year when President Fawn Sharp, one of our witnesses here today, testified before our committee about the need for expanding eligibility for coastal zone management grants to include tribes. Now, the historic purpose of matching fund requirements is to help ensure local or state level buy-in for projects and to help leverage additional sources of funding. Those are legitimate goals, and often that works well. For example, one of our most important and popular programs in this committee, the North American Wetland Conservation Act, requires a one-to-one match for wetland conservation programs, and that has helped leverage over $3.5 billion in non-federal money for critical wetland conservation and coastal protection projects around the country, something that its supporters are and should be proud of. Unfortunately, these same matching fund requirements can also prohibit good projects from getting funds if a community, state, territory, or tribe just can't come up with that non-federal match. So we have to think about that situation too. As we prepared for this hearing, we heard many stories of applicants who just gave up on their grant applications because they knew that federal match requirement would prohibit them. We know we need to do more to give these communities a chance to benefit from these programs. And I hope we can tackle this challenge together in a spirit of bipartisan problem solving. I'm grateful that Congressman Graves is standing in as the ranking member today, because I know that he, in his own district and his own state, understands some of these injustices and how they're playing out on the ground. Unfortunately, though, our colleagues across the aisle, in terms of the witness they've selected today, have once again chosen to search their Rolodex of hyper-partisan junior varsity think tanks, and they've invited a witness who is funded by dark money and oil companies to espouse the fringe contrarian view that environmental justice itself is unjust and that communities of color somehow just need fewer environmental protections and more deregulation. I know many of my Republican colleagues would like to have a more serious conversation on these issues than that perspective would suggest. Barriers to equity in climate resilience are things that we can address, I think, together through careful and smart legislation. And I'm grateful to the witnesses who are joining us today for participating in the hearing and sharing their background and expertise. We have a lot to learn, I think, from each other and from all of them. I look forward to a constructive dialogue. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Graves for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. And as I look at the number of members that are on the screen right now, the hearing, of course, our chairman, Mr. Huffman, who I want to thank you again for your visit to Louisiana. My great friend, Ms. Napolitano, my good friend, Mr. Lowenthal, and thank you for coming down to Louisiana and inviting me to your state so we can see one another's issues. These are all friends that also serve on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee where we have worked together in the past. And in fact, just within the last 2 years have made, in my opinion, remarkable bipartisan progress on enacting laws like the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, which begins this shift from being an entirely reactive posture to disasters to really leaning forward much greater through the BRIC or pre-disaster mitigation program, through the coming in and defining really what communities are facing in regard to future threats, as the chairman identified sea rise, or at least alluded to sea rise and other challenges moving forward. Look, I live in South Louisiana. 90% of the coastal wetlands loss in the continental United States occurs in my state. 90%, and that's not just a statistic, because just within recent weeks we had Hurricane Marco and Hurricane Laura. Never in my life have I seen two hurricanes trajectories colliding and hitting our state at the same time. Thank God, Hurricane Marco ultimately fizzled a bit, but Hurricane Laura dealt a devastating blow to our state. We're in the Greek alphabet now, and Hurricane Delta came in and pounded our state just recently. In fact, we had worse winds in some areas well outside of where the hurricane made landfall from Hurricane Delta causing devastating consequences once again. And the fact that it made landfall 12 miles away from where Hurricane Laura hit is just extraordinary. Of course, we've got the backdrop of coronavirus on top of it. It's awful. And Mr. Chairman, I'm glad we're having this hearing today, but I got to tell you, and you and I have talked about this in the past, we've talked about it in the Transportation Committee. You know, the thing is we have different coastal programs or resources that could be better coordinated or utilized under EPA, under Department of Interior, under NOAA, obviously the Corps of Engineers, HUD, FEMA. And so we have this alphabet soup of programs, and some of them work really, really well, and other ones are complete disaster. I agree with you. I totally agree with you that we do need to take a better look at cost shares and where they're appropriate and how they're appropriate, and absolutely take into consideration coronavirus. Look, here's the reality. Study after study after study, Congressional Budget Office, FEMA, National Institutes of Building Standards, you name it. They've all done analysis and they've determined, and I've witnessed it right here at home from some of the investments that we've made. Making investments in the resiliency of your communities saves the government money. It is an investment. It's not pork, it's an investment. And as long as we have the right principles in place that determine where those dollars are spent to ensure that it does help to protect the resiliency and the ecological productivity of our communities and our systems, if it does truly protect our communities, our homes, and our families, our businesses, our economy, those are good investments. That let me say it again, it's not pork, it's investments, and it pays off. Now, everything I said now is really nice so far, but I think right around minute 4 is when you started throwing jabs at us, and so I'm around minute 4, so I'll go ahead and grab you back a little bit. Mr. Chairman, look, you can sit there and say whatever you want. In fact, I'll yield you all my time, and you can talk for all day long. But here's the facts. You want to talk about parties? Let's talk about parties. The reality is this. I have tried over and over and over again in this committee and in the Transportation Committee to get members of the Democrat side of this committee to make investments in coastal Louisiana. And you know what? Every single time you voted against climate adaptation funding, you voted against revenue sharing, you voted against increasing the pie of funds that are available to coastal states and territories. And so I can't think of a word other than oozing hypocrisy to describe much of what was said in terms of the jabs that were being made. We're the ones who are advocating for these things. And you know what? I represent people who just died in hurricanes. And so any of you can stand up and you can talk about how great you are and things that you've done. We've got a black and white voting record, which demonstrates people that have made irresponsible decisions that have resulted in the death of people that I represent. And it's inappropriate. And so I will speak all day long with any of you that want to talk about constructive investments and how we can work together in a bipartisan way, because there is nothing that should be partisan about this. But let's be a little careful about some of the arrows we're slinging whenever the facts point to a very, very different story. Yield back.
All right, thank you, Ranking Member Graves. I will now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Fawn Sharp, President of the National Congress of American Indians. After Ms. Sharp, we will hear from Dr. Osborne Jelks, Assistant Professor of Environmental and Health Sciences at Spelman College. Followed by her, we will hear from Mr. Ernesto Diaz, Director of Puerto Rico Coastal Zone Management Programs. And then our next witness will be Dr. Holly Bamford. She is the Chief Conservation Officer at NIFWIF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And then finally, we will hear from Ms. Donna Jackson, National Advisory Council Member at Project 21. Let me remind all the witnesses that under our committee rules, they need to limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. There's a clock on your screen that should help you stick to that 5-minute mark. But the entire statement that you've submitted today will be part of the hearing record. When you begin, you'll see that timer is black and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute left. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use grid view on this software so that they can pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself again and to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to finish their testimony before we bring it back to the members for questioning. So the chair now recognizes President Sharp to begin. You're recognized for 5 minutes, President Sharp.
Yohach, Anjak Hiwishka. Good morning, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, I thank you for holding the hearing today. I am Fawn Sharp, President of the Cornwall Indian Nation and President of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest and largest organization serving the broad interests of tribal nations and communities. Since time immemorial, tribal cultures, peoples, and economies have been intricately linked to our ability to manage the resources, natural resources within our homelands. Many of our resource programs are funded by the federal government due to the unique political and fiduciary relationship between tribal nations and the United States, which resulted from the forced cessation of our lands and resources. Presently, one of the ways the trust relationship is funded is through grants. However, despite numerous federal programs, grant programs being available to tribal nations, many barriers exist to accessing those funds, which are connected to the federal trust responsibility. My testimony today will focus on two types of barriers faced by tribal nations. The first is financial, and the second is equitable. Additionally, I will also spotlight Indian countries' funding needs to respond to the climate crisis. First, I will address the impacts of the grant requirements on Indian countries' access to federal funding. Many grant programs across the federal government require tribal nations to provide matching funds and further prohibit or restrict use of funds that can count as a match. This requirement disparately impacts tribal nations. The GAO, in a report involving telecommunication funding, found that matching fund requirements can be difficult for some tribes to obtain due to the limited revenue and access to capital, as tribes cannot collateralize tribal property and therefore oftentimes are unable to bank loans for infrastructure projects. In addition to the matching requirements, competitive grants disadvantage tribal nations because the grant structure forces them to compete with state and private entities. Additionally, when tribal governments must compete amongst each other, smaller and less resourced tribal nations are often left out, and often they are the most vulnerable. The Bureau of Reclamation's Water Smart program is just one such example. This program provides funding for water and energy efficiency and includes climate impact assessments. Like many other programs open to tribal nations, this program is competitive and requires matching funds and limits the federal cost share to 50%. Many tribal nations have difficulty competing with larger resource state and local governments. They have neither the capital nor the ability to raise capital to meet the match requirement. In 2001, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Community Development Financial Institution Fund reported that many financial institutions were hesitant to lend to Indian country because of a poor understanding of tribal sovereignty. This is still true almost 20 years later. Additionally, unlike state governments, tribal nations are limited in their ability to raise revenue via taxes because of state dual taxation of economic activities on many tribal lands. As a result, tribal nations do not have the tax bases to meet a non-federal match requirement, nor can they borrow against future anticipated revenues, as can their state counterparts. As a result, tribal nations have limited access to funding to resolve critical water disparities, such as addressing the 12.5% of tribal homes which lack adequate sanitation facilities, which is 20 times larger than the national average. To address these issues, the subcommittee should determine alternatives to competitive grant funding to increase access and remove matching requirements for tribal nations all across the federal grant programs that will impact environmental, natural resource, and climate change funding. Next, I will address the importance of government parity in accessing federal grant programs. In addition to restrictive grant requirements, tribal nations are often excluded directly from accessing government funding. An example is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This fund provides funding to protect federal lands, waters, wildlife habitat, which all overlay tribal ancestral homelands and sacred spaces. Tribal nations continue to have significant cultural and natural resource interests and trusts and treaty rights that extend well beyond the reservation boundaries. Despite this interest, tribal nations have had limited access to this funding. Between 1965 and 2016, only 92 of approximately 40,000 grants were awarded to tribal nations. For those that did have access to funding, they had to apply through their respective states, ensure their applications were consistent with a statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, and 3, they had to be selected by the state. Tribal nations as sovereign governments should not be required to obtain funding for management of their homelands and sacred spaces through a state. This creates an improper delegation of the federal trust responsibility. To address this fiduciary responsibility and issue, tribal governments should be provided parity and be able to directly access government funding through the LCWF and other programs. Lastly, I want to address funding Indian countries' response to climate change. Climate change threatens the health, culture, and economies of tribal nations and peoples. My own nation is undertaking a relocation of a village because our homes are being lost to sea level rise and storm surges. Funding climate action is critical to our welfare and lives. The issue identified above have particular impact on tribal communities confronting the climate crisis. To address these climate-based disparities, Congress should ensure the following. First, full and meaningful consultation with decision makers and consultation enforcement. Second, integrate tribal nations into congressional and executive branch climate planning. Third, securing land, water, wildlife, and fisheries resources. Fourth, develop co-management opportunities to support intergovernmental partnerships and integrate tribal traditional knowledge. Fifth, finance climate action via increased appropriations, grants, public-private financing opportunities. Sixth, and finally, ensure government parity in climate action. In conclusion, I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions. Siok Wheel.
Go now to Dr. Osborne Jelks. Dr. Osborne Jelks, welcome to the subcommittee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon to Chairman Huffman, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Graves, and other members of the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee. I thank you for inviting me to share with you on today and for taking up this very timely and important topic. My name is Nataki Osborne Jelks, and I'm an assistant professor in the Environmental and Health Sciences program at Spelman College, a historically Black college and global leader in the education of women of African descent located in Atlanta, Georgia. In addition to my role at Spelman, I lead the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, a community-based environmental justice organization that works to grow a cleaner, greener, healthier, and more sustainable West Atlanta. WAWA serves low wealth and communities of color in the Proctor, Utoy, and Sandy Creek watersheds of Northwest and Southwest Atlanta. These are communities that are overburdened with environmental stressors, but often least represented at environmental decision-making tables. We were established as a result of community efforts to halt discriminatory wastewater treatment practices in West Atlanta, and we've grown to become an impactful force in community-centered sustainable development. For over 20 years, WAWA has pioneered efforts to advance community-led watershed protection and restoration, environmental education, and environmental justice in Northwest and Southwest Atlanta neighborhoods. For over 4 years, WAWA served as the Urban Waters Federal Partnership Ambassador for Atlanta's Proctor Creek watershed. The Urban Waters Federal Partnership Program is part of EPA's Urban Waters Program, and it seeks to reconnect urban communities, particularly those that are overburdened or economically distressed with their waterways, to become stewards for clean urban water. Through this partnership, communities gain economic, environmental, and social benefits and collaborate with federal, state, and local agencies, as well as community-led efforts to achieve common goals. WAWA has worked for a number of years with Proctor Creek communities to improve and protect health, to improve the environment, and to strengthen our local economies. While Atlanta is not a coastal community, we are all connected. From the creeks to the coast, oceans and seas, we both, inland and coastal communities, are impacted by climate change. Our waterways are plagued with pollution. We see and feel the effects of flooding, erosion, and land loss, displacement, loss of material property, economic devastation, and poor health outcomes. As a nation, we must be committed to protecting and enhancing our coast and coastal communities for current and future generations. We must do this work through careful planning and regulation of environmentally sustainable development, rigorous use of science, strong public participation, education, and effective public-private community partnerships. Black Belt communities in the Deep South and in our coastal areas are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Communities of color and low-income communities in coastal areas across the country are facing displacement. They are being disconnected from their sense of place, disconnected from their homes, and becoming climate refugees. For Gullah Geechee nations who are descendants of both escaped and freed slaves off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, dealing with the reality of sea level rise and other impacts of climate change are everyday occurrences. To increase opportunities for environmental justice, climate resilience, and to ensure the protection of our waters, oceans, wildlife, and human communities in these coastal areas, we must invest in the natural resources and in the proximate human communities. More robust investments must be made in environmental justice communities who are not only bearing the brunt of inadequate action on climate change, but who are also suffering from systemic inequities that have shaped past inadequate investments, or in some cases, divestment of needed financial resources to ensure whole, healthy, and thriving communities. Funds need to be available and get into the hands of community-based environmental justice organizations who know and understand the needs of these communities that bear the brunt of climate vulnerabilities. More equitable funding programs are needed. The communities who are impacted most by climate change should be prioritized in funding. Approaches like what is proposed in the Environmental Justice for All Act are a great start to the types of investments that we need. Sound management of our natural resources supports sustainable development, a healthy environment, and protection of both wildlife and human communities. As I close, I ask you to consider opportunities to bolster the investments in environmental justice communities, remove barriers associated with getting funds into the hands of grassroots organizations, not just the nonprofits and other organizations who are working with communities. Allow them to steer their dollars in the areas of greatest need. And finally, providing opportunities for multi-year funding as well as larger grants are needed. We cannot fix systemic problems with an incremental approach supported by one-year non-renewable small grants. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Osborne Jelks. The committee will now recognize Mr. Ernesto Diaz for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to testify before the subcommittee. My name is Ernesto Diaz Velazquez. I'm a marine scientist and serve as director of the Puerto Rico Coastal Management Program and the Puerto Rico Coral Reef Conservation and Management Program. In that capacity, I also serve as Puerto Rico's point of contact to the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force and the Coastal States Organization. For more than 25 years, I have collaborated or led projects funded by federal agencies such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, EPA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and FEMA. In my testimony, I will be referring to federal grants and funding regularly announced to conduct natural resources conservation and restoration projects, environmental protection and hazard mitigation projects, as well as federal funding opportunities to build coastal communities' resilience. These federal funding opportunities are seldom pursued by island jurisdictions, among other reasons because of matching requirements or lack of capacity to develop specific components of such federal grants. Under normal circumstances, matching requirements typically range from 1:1 to 65 to 35% or 75-25% ratios. In cases of presidential disaster declarations, state matching can be waived. Although capacity varies across island jurisdictions, we all face the same type of challenges: evident needs and lack of funding. Historically, jurisdictions like Puerto Rico have placed emphasis on securing funding for health and education. However, coastal and marine issues such as beach erosion, coastal coral reef conservation and restoration, as well as water resources funding disparities have not been adequately addressed in appropriate ways. These issues became more evident in Puerto Rico in 2017 after Hurricane Maria. with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour, ripping roofs of homes, uprooting trees, downing cell towers, and severely impacting coral reefs, beaches, and mangroves. Electricity was cut off to 100% of the island, and access to clean water and food became limited for most, resulting in a severe humanitarian crisis where over 3,000 people died, indirectly or directly related to the hurricane impacts. According to the Puerto Rico Central Office for Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resilience of Puerto Rico, a total of $61 billion have been appropriated by Congress for Puerto Rico recovery efforts. However, only $16 billion, or 27%, have been distributed to recipients, subrecipients, and agencies. 3 years after Hurricane Maria, impacts to communities have not been effectively addressed because of administrative bottleneck. Coral reefs, beaches, dunes, and coastal natural infrastructure impacted by Hurricane Maria are also waiting for restoration and repair. The Puerto Rico's Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, through the Core 3 office, submitted 2 projects to FEMA under Section 428, or public assistance, and 44 letters of intent were submitted under Section 404, Hazard Grant Mitigation Program, to repair and mitigate hazards through natural and nature-based infrastructure. In that process, we were able to present evidence that coral reefs provided effective protection to densely populated San Juan metro area by attenuating between 94 and 97% of the incoming wave energy associated to Hurricane Maria storm waves. Investing in natural infrastructure repairs and restoration is one of the most effective means to reduce cost of future disasters. However, benefit cost analysis tools used by FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, HUD, for example, do not favor nature-based solutions. On September 29th, on the other hand, FEMA approved the use of ecosystem service benefits applying to all types of hazard mitigation and public assistance projects eligible under FEMA mitigation programs. In terms of policy, this is a step in the right direction. However, the issues associated to matching requirements and lack of capacity remain. Concerted planning, training, and funding efforts are needed to overcome challenges and upgrade island jurisdictions' capacity to meet grant requirements. Local leadership and capacity building are essential to this process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
As the chair now recognizes Dr. Bamford for 5 minutes. Welcome, Dr. Bamford.
Good afternoon and good morning to many. Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Graves, members of the subcommittee for the invitation to this hearing, and I'm really honored to be joining the other witnesses today on this important topic. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, also known as NFWF, and NFWF is an independent 501c3 nonprofit. It was created in '84 by a bipartisan manner by Congress, and it was specifically created to develop public-private partnerships. And this approach of blending federal and private funds to create partnerships has enabled the foundation to make significant investments in our mission, which is to conserve fish, wildlife, and the habitats at a landscape scale. Since our creation, we have become the nation's largest private conservation grant maker, funding close to 19,000 projects to over 5,000 organizations, both big and small, in all 50 states, DC, and US territories. So for over 35 years, the foundation has really strived to achieve some of the greatest conservation impacts through these partnerships nationwide. As the chairman has mentioned, the impacts to coasts have become more frequent, and the foundation has been investing in restoration of natural systems to protect not only the fish and wildlife that depend on them, but the coastal communities behind them. And this enables the entire coastal ecosystem to recover more quickly from the impacts of storms, floods, and other natural hazards. So these investments that we make are through grant making. And to select grants, they have to have the most meaningful impact, and that requires a process that accounts for not only matching funds, but accounts for science, it accounts for cost effectiveness, geographic diversity, capacity building, grantee diversity, and sustainability of those efforts. And we make decisions based on how each proposal measures up against these factors and meets the conservation program's priorities. So based upon many years of administering both federal and non-federal grants and working on coastal resilience, we have gained some valuable insight, and I'd like to offer just a couple observations here today for the hearing. The first, and we heard this from other witnesses, is matching funds. Now, NFWF strives to provide matching funds for many of our programs that we implement. and many applicants can provide matching funds, sometimes beyond what's required. But we also see there's instances where matching fund can be a barrier. And so we work with those applicants to navigate those challenges. We don't want the lack of matching funds to disqualify a strong proposal. In these instances, NIFWIF has flexibility to use a diversity of funding sources that either we have raised or through other means to help an applicant. And so this flexibility enables us to work with applicants from underserved and poor communities that submit really strong proposals, but just have fewer resources at their disposal. Second is capacity building. This is really important. Many coastal communities are just beginning to develop plans for building more resilient infrastructure and have little knowledge on how to proceed, particularly using nature. So NIFWIF has created specific funding categories to address these needs and help applicants better plan. We have a long-term strategy, which is what we call building a pipeline. It's a pipeline of projects that we award the capacity building up front, working with communities to develop those planning projects, figure out the permitting process, so they eventually can apply for additional funds to actually implement those plans and build nature-based infrastructure into their communities. Third, outreach is really important as well to get a diversity of proposals from all parts of the coast. And so NIFWIF has a number of outreach strategies, including webinars, in-person workshops, and with coast communities. And we also deploy what we call technical assistance providers across the coast who work with local communities to help make organizations aware of our funding opportunities, as well as pull applications together. These advisors are free of charge to our partners and to people developing proposals. And the community advisors will be on the ground working in those communities that historically have not had the opportunity to develop those expertise. And so this ensures that we build a diverse pool of applicants for our programs. And finally, we consider a suite of factors in our competitive selection process. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just match, but it's the outcomes, it's the technical merit, it's community engagements, it's budgets, it's cost effectiveness. This is important to ensure that we award grants to a diverse slate of applicants that will achieve the greatest conservation impact. And just to give you an example, many watershed programs end up in headwaters, which are very rural areas, all the way down to the coast, which is very urban areas. And this requires us to balance those proposals we receive across those various conservation needs. And there's differences in different watersheds. And so there's also differences in capabilities of those grantees, both their strengths and their weaknesses. And so we have to weigh all that against the entire package to ensure we put the best foot forward in conservation. So just in closing, our nation's natural resource is vitally important work. Communities across the country increasingly need nature to protect themselves. And as this committee continues to examine the federal grant-making process, I hope my testimony offered some insights to make the process equitable as possible. So thank you very much.
Appreciate that, Dr. Bamford. The chair now recognizes Ms. Jackson to testify. You're recognized for 5 minutes, ma'am.
Okay. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McCloskey, and Graves, thank you for inviting me to testify on environmental justice and federal grant-making issues. My name is Donna Jackson, and I am a member of the National Advisory Council for Project 21, America's oldest Black conservative organization. The views that I express on this subject are my own and not necessarily those of Project 21. There are far too many people who try to make environmental justice into a one-sided issue. They focus only on claims that disadvantaged and minority communities are disproportionate victims of environmental threats, such as water pollution, air pollution, climate change, and others. But I think the greater threat comes from the disproportionate impacts of environmental policies and the damage they do to the economic aspirations of those who can least afford them. Most of us participating in this hearing today are in a comfortable economic position. Environmental laws and regulations that may raise our electric or water bills 10 or 20% or add an additional 50 cents to the price of a gallon of gasoline isn't going to change our lives very much, if at all. We can afford to be complacent about the cost of environmental policies. But for those struggling to make ends meet, the economic impacts can be devastating. According to a recent survey by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, 1 in 3 households face difficulties paying for their energy needs. 1 in 5 report having to forego necessities such as food and medicine to pay their energy bill. And the numbers are nearly double for Black households and just as staggering for Latino households. And yet, proposed environmental measures like the Green New Deal would further raise energy costs, worsening energy poverty, and leading to an even tougher sacrifice. In addition, most of us participating in this hearing have comfortable white-collar jobs. We can afford to be indifferent to the impacts of environmental policies that may block a new factory or a new natural gas pipeline or a new oil well or a new mine. And we may not even think about the jobs these projects would have created. But for those at the lower rungs of the economic ladder and who don't have the benefit of a college degree, these high-wage, blue-collar jobs are literally the ticket to a better life for themselves and their family. In addition, other minorities who seek to climb the economic ladder through small business ownership, as pointed out in Project 21's Blueprint for a Better Deal for Black America, are disproportionately burdened by regulatory costs, including environmental regulations. The same is true for affordable housing. Environmental laws and regulations can serve to kill new housing projects and raise the cost of existing housing. California is probably the worst state when it comes to affordable housing, due in part to its costly environmental measures. And once again, environmental justice movement may be part of the problem and not the solution. I can tell you that most Black families don't want handouts. We have more ambition than just to get by a little more comfortably. We want upward mobility. We want opportunities that give us economic independence. We want home ownership, not subsidized rent. The American dream is alive and well in the hearts of minorities and low-income families, and we need to make certain that policymakers don't stand in anyone's way. And that is the perspective from which I look at the question of environmental grants. If the purpose of these grants is to pursue policies that serve to raise the cost of living on those who can least afford it, or to stifle the creation of good paying jobs for those individuals who most need it, then minority communities are better off without the money. The only winners seem to be environmental activists, regulators, and lawyers, not the communities that these people claim to serve. In conclusion, I was a supporter of President Clinton's welfare reform efforts many years ago. He and others realized that these poorly designed programs were hurting the very people they were supposed to help. I think the environmental justice movement is at a similar crossroads. It is time to end environmental justice as we know it. And I would like to add, what I do as a volunteer. I receive $0, 0 contracts. I receive 0 grants, and I am not paid by any energy company in America. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. I thank the panel for their testimony. A reminder for members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on the questions that we will now proceed to for the members. And I'd like to begin by recognizing the chairman of the Full Natural Resources Committee, Raul Grijalva, for 5 minutes.
Did you do? Thank you, Chairman Huffman, and for holding this hearing today, and the witnesses for sharing their expertise and their stories. I think this means an example of what we need to do to legislate well. We must listen and learn about these challenges. If the communities who need the assistance the most are ineligible or can't compete for funding, that's a problem we absolutely need to address. And I thank the chairman for pointing that out with his opening discussion. So I hope that the conversation that we have today and the follow-up that I'm sure Chairman Huffman will seek is we can inform ourselves about the legislation that I think needs to be very much so part of our portfolio for the Natural Resources Committee going forward. Dr. Jelks, you hinted, if I may, at something in your testimony that's deeply unsettling. Big groups, big universities go for the funding, use the little guys, the grassroots organizations, the communities of color, to check the box that they're helping under-resourced communities without fully integrating their goals, the priorities, or seriously communicating the project with the community itself. Tell us a little more about that, and how do you see those true partnerships happening? How do we prioritize projects so that that can happen? With that, it's a two-part, if you can, Doctor.
Thank you so much for your question. You raise a very important issue that I've experienced from both sides as an HBCU faculty member, as well as the leader of a community-based environmental justice organization. And so many times, the bigger groups, the bigger institutions apply for these large grants, and they essentially are checking the box. And so what I recommend is that in these funding RFPs, that there be some requirement around parity. There are many RFPs that we're starting to see now that actually require that community engagement. So they require you to have community partners, but there are no guidelines around how those community partners should be valued in that relationship. And so what happens is those bigger groups, they, with their big overheads, they take the lion's share of those resources, and they have expectations for HBCUs, for community-based environmental justice organizations to do more with less, to carry the lion's share of some of the work in terms of the community engagement, which is so very important to these processes. And those groups end up ultimately getting underfunded in the process. And so I just would I would recommend really looking a lot more at how these requirements are laid. It's not enough just to require that there be those partnerships, but that there be some equity built into the budgets that go along with the funding request. I think that's going to be key. I would also suggest that there be special or that there be opportunities that are targeted again toward those communities, understanding those unique needs of environmental justice communities, understanding some of the barriers that have been mentioned by some of the other speakers today with respect to why those communities cannot access funding. And understand that those communities have the best sense of what the issues and challenges are, and in many cases have the best sense on how to solve those questions. How to solve those problems. I'm not sure if others are having a problem, but I'm not able to hear you, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, were you going to follow up there? You're muted if you were. I think he might be locked up there. Did any of the other witnesses want to speak to Chairman Grijalva's question? All right, if we can.
Okay, I'm having some real trouble. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
We had a little mess up here. I was asking Dr. Bamford, can you tell us how the NFWF constructs review panels? And would you say that there's adequate representation of the diverse communities that we're having this conversation about on the review panels?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So NFWF constructs review panels. Basically, we have developed minimal review standards to ensure we have standardization across all of our programs. And this includes a requirement of multiple reviewers. They're made up of technical experts. They're made up of regional experts. They're made up of scientists, both inside and outside the foundation. And these reviewers really look at standard criteria to look at the goals and priorities of the proposal, the technical merit of the work plan, the cost effectiveness, and the long-term sustainability. Now, each of these reviewers have an area of expertise. They all look across these projects to rank them. But the most important part is really when we come together at the end to look at all the projects in totality. So not each individual projects, but to ensure we're funding as a group the most impactful conservation grants. And at that point, there's a lot of times we start to look at other criteria such as geographic representation, mix of urban and rural projects, mix of coastal and upland projects, mix of small and large organizations, and so forth. Now, the representation of the review also happens even before the review starts. NIFWIF likes to go out into the community and work with them through webinars, in-person workshops, talk with the community to figure out what issues they might have as they're developing. And for example, we did this both in CNMI as well as in Charleston, South Carolina, to learn about the community needs and to encourage them to apply for funding so we knew what the community wanted and needed before they even applied and got reviewed.
Thank you. And President Sharp, I just want to thank you for your testimony. I thought the points you made about seek alternatives for matching mandate and the parity issue that's so important to indigenous folks and tribal governments and tribes. Thank you very much for that. And I'm sure that Mr. Chairman Huffman will be pursuing some of those as part of a remedy issue. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My notes indicate that the next member to recognize is Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, are you with us?
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excellent.
Thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to be on here. Thank you, Congressman Garrett, for being here as well today. I want to also thank the witnesses for this very important issue. You know, I'm extremely grateful for another chance to discuss environmental justice, a topic that we touched on in a previous committee hearing on October 1st. Mr. Chairman, as a member who was involved in that hearing, if you recall, I introduced H.R. 8487, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act, that morning with 10 of my Republican colleagues. And that hearing made one thing abundantly clear: both Republicans and Democrats alike care about environmental justice. Our approach is a little different, however, but we need to figure out how we can approach this important issue together. On one hand, you have Republicans in our pragmatic approach to the issue through my legislation. Specifically, my bill would ensure proposed policies that alleviate energy poverty in at-risk communities by directing various government agencies to study these policies to help determine whether they help to rectify or exacerbate energy poverty. On the other hand, my Democrat colleagues are taking a more haphazard approach to extreme mandates and radical policies without regard to their actual effects. There's the so-called environmental justice for all. It would do three things. It would draw out a lengthy NEPA process to delay new energy infrastructure projects, impose needless fees on energy development, thereby causing unnecessary job losses, and finally expand avenues for legal challenges that would line the pockets of trial lawyers. And many of my friends across the aisle have great friends there and great supporters, and I get it. But it's not the way we should be doing it. And the contrast is very clear. And while Republicans are looking to ensure that policies that we put forth are beneficial to our most vulnerable communities, my colleagues across the aisle prefer to focus on an agenda that would eviscerate the energy accessibility. So, Ms. Jackson, I really want to say thank you for your powerful testimony, and I thank you for being here today. And, you know, a lot of what we discussed helps to outline the contrast between the approaches the two parties have. And I was especially moved by your sentiments on the threat of disproportionate impacts of environmental policies and the damage they do to economic aspirations of those in the most vulnerable communities in the nation. I want to ask you two questions, and I'm going to put them together and let you just expound on these. Can you, how complacent, you talked about 2 points regarding and so I'm going to ask you, how complacent policies like the Green New Deal could have a devastating effect on energy poverty, and how wrong-footed, how poor these policies could, or how bad they could be in eliminating job opportunities for those looking for a better life. If you could take a few minutes and expound, I'd appreciate it. Maybe a minute and a half.
Okay, well, I'm here to ask for balance when you're looking at the risk of environmental threats, and then the risk of environmental policy. We cannot close down a factory because we want to eliminate a smoke screen, but then kill all the jobs and put everybody in poverty. we have to balance that in terms of upward mobility for all Americans. You know, these high-paying blue-collar jobs allow individuals the opportunity into a gateway of the middle class. That means that they're able to own homes. Homeowners on average has a net worth of 36 to 45% more than those of renters. And what we're doing is we're denying these individuals the opportunity to be homeowners. We're not thinking about the loss of future financial investment in terms of home ownership, and the time value of money. We actually absolutely have to get people out of poverty, and that only comes from high-paying private sector jobs, not from grants and giveaways. We've seen in the past that these grants and these handouts don't work. They actually impoverish more people with these mandated regulations that require people to stay poor to be eligible.
Ms. Jackson, I just want to say, I would enjoy sitting here and listening to you speak for the next 3 hours. I think you're so spot on with what's wrong with America, and I hope someday in a future hearing that I can meet you somewhere, because I want to shake your hand for your passion. And I really appreciate you acknowledging that nobody's paying you to say this. This is from your heart. And I hope that we can all come together in this committee to really do what's right by our impoverished communities, to give them a hand up and not continuous handout, which is what you're advocating. You want opportunities, not to be suppressed. So thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for allowing me to be on here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn. We'll go now to Congresswoman Grace Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Much, Mr. Chair. Pardon me. Listening with great interest. First, to Dr. Bransford Foundation, do you have grants, or do you work with the territories, the Native Americans? Are you nationwide?
Yes, ma'am, we do. We work with a number of different indigenous people. We funded a significant number of tribal nations in California and other states out west, as well as on the east and in the northwest, so pretty much all across the country. And to be more explicit, in the National Coastal Resiliency Fund, we've funded close to $7 million to indigenous people. And so we're really proud of that, and hopefully helping them become more resilient.
Well, it is great to know that. The President Sharp testimony indicates the barriers the tribes face. And what would you do different? What would you recommend to this committee and to other committees that they consider for grants to tribes?
Yes, I really appreciate that question. I think the first thing that everyone in Congress must do is take a hard look that what we're witnessing today, the apocalyptic challenges of a global pandemic, of climate change, these are all symptoms of a much deeper imbalance that didn't begin in 2020 or even last year or a decade or a lifetime ago.
Okay.
These imbalances began many years ago, and we must price carbon. We must hold those who are directly accountable for polluting the air and the environment, because grant funding is limited. The scale of this pandemic and the scale of climate change cannot be met with public resources. And those who are directly responsible for polluting the air and causing all the environmental degradation and damage must be held accountable and priced. That's the only way we're going to get the resources. And as long as we don't do that, we're going to be stretched thin. Public resources are becoming scarce, and we're not going to be able to meet the need. And we have a sense of urgency to meet the challenges of today's environment.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I'm noticing is we don't have set-asides in any committee for territories, especially Guam and Puerto Rico and others. What is the plan for inclusion, making sure that they get a set-aside? Anybody have any information on that? No? Well, I guess Mr. Chair, that we should consider something similar to this granting territories, tribal tribes and the sovereign nations to have a set aside so they can be their own judges on that. I would propose maybe a joint hearing of all the agencies to see what they can do. And that would be the Water Agency, the Tribe Subcommittee, the agencies, APA, Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, Forest Service, ACE, and FEMA, to find out what are their ideas about getting equity to the people who are not getting service, who are not able to apply for the grants because they don't have the capability, they don't have resources, they don't have a grant writer, whatever it is. But somehow we need to get to the bottom of this. And to the lady from Donna Jackson, I can tell you I have a Superfund site in my area that affects about 14 million people. The water was contaminated, and we were told we wouldn't have drinking water in the next few years. So we had EPA go after the polluters to make sure that they were able to pay for some of the cleanup, and that is being effectively done. It's been 30 years in the making. So it is a necessity to have EPA and others have good policy that we enforce. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I should have mentioned this at the outset. We, of course, invited some of those federal agencies that you mentioned to be part of this hearing today. And unfortunately, it's the same old story. They continue to decline to participate in these hearings. So with that, we'll keep trying. And we will turn to Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all the witnesses today. I want to say hello to Mr. Ernesto Diaz that is representing the island here today. And I need to begin by saying that I have joined Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott and Congressman Darren Soto in introducing the Restoring Resilient Reef Act, which is a bipartisan and bicameral legislation, to reauthorize and modernize the Coral Reef Conservation Act, which expired 16 years ago. And I think it's important now that we're talking about this, how important it is and how this affects local communities, specifically the territories. Among other things, this bill will authorize NOAA to provide state block grants to allow U.S. coastal coral jurisdictions like Puerto Rico to apply for funding to meet the priorities they have set for restoration and management of their own coral reef. This bill will also qualify certain coral reefs to be eligible for public assistance under the Stafford Act, and will provide new avenues for the provision of emergency funds to address coral reef emergencies like disease outbreaks, invasive species, coral bleaching, natural disasters, among many others. I think this provision will greatly help address some of the challenges Puerto Rico and other coral jurisdictions face in the accessing federal funding. And I will be interested in hearing your views about them. In interest of time, I will ask that you can submit them for the record, Mr. Diaz and the rest of the members of the panel. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make some questions about your testimony, Mr. Diaz. You were leaving aside FEMA. There are specific coastal protection grants program that Puerto Rico is not taking full advantage of it right now, or not even bothering to apply. Can you answer me that?
So we've been working with FEMA immediately after the hurricanes impacted Puerto Rico. We requested public assistance to repair coral reef infrastructure that performed effectively, even attenuating up to 97% of the incoming wave energy that was to affect areas such as the San Juan Metro area. However, the technicalities on the public assistance guidance, what FEMA uses for public assistance, evaluation of projects, impede that those infrastructure, even if they perform better than man-made infrastructure, to receive funding because they were not designed, planned, and constructed by men. So that's an issue that should be addressed at one point. I think that on the mitigation side, FEMA recently adopted on September 29th a policy that will take into account benefit cost analysis in their benefit cost analysis tools, the ecosystem services. The major concern here is that design life for man-made infrastructure typically ranges from 25 to 50 years, while nature-based options can continue mutating on themselves and kind of being retrofitting themselves to continue adapting to changing conditions. And we are experiencing sea level rise, and we need to adjust those infrastructure. If we don't do that, we'll continue facing the type of disasters that we faced during Hurricane Maria.
I know, Mr. Diaz, and I appreciate your leadership in this effort. And all we know that with the Army Corps of Engineers, we managed to secure more than $3 million for actually make the first coastal erosion study in Puerto Rico that is going to impact the whole island, as well as money that was put aside in the Bipartisan Budget Act, as well as FEMA funds specifically for what you're telling me about. And in your written testimony, you mentioned that the Puerto Rico Department of Natural and Environmental Resources submitted 2 projects to FEMA under Section 428 and 44 letters of intent under Section 404, which is Hazard Grants Mitigation Program to repair, mitigate hazards throughout natural and nature-based infrastructure. I'm part, as Mr. Graves, of Transportation Committee, and we actually passed amendments to the Stafford Act, allowing a lot of these funds to come to the island. Can you please provide to my office the specifics of those project worksheets you mentioned on your testimony to see how we can follow up and expedite those? And if all those letters of intent and project worksheets you mentioned were to be approved, how many your department is ready to begin on?
Yeah, so in terms of being shovel ready, there are about 3 that would be shovel ready or near shovel ready, but the remaining ones we would need to invest in time into developing letters of intent into projects. That's one of the issues that I presented as part of my testimony, that while we do have the capacity in the island, the amount of federal funding opportunities and the needs in Puerto Rico demand an increase in capacity. So we do have the capacity, but for limited projects. So how do we expand that? That's something that we need to do in order to improve our capacity to tap into more resources. Matching is the other issue. I know the Core 3, the Office for Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resiliency of Puerto Rico, has been creative to being able to enable an alternate way of meeting matching through the CDBG funding. So that's an important good step towards enabling jurisdictions like Puerto Rico and insular areas or jurisdictions to make the matching requirements for these important initiatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you, and I will submit to the record the rest of the questions for the members of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now go across the Pacific Ocean for our next member. And I've often said you got to get up early in the morning to keep up with Congressman Khalili Sablon. And that's because right now it's 5 a.m. his time, and he's been on this call for an hour already. So you recognize Khalili for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panelists joining us this morning. Again, I appreciate Ms. Napolitano's suggestions to address or give the insular area some set aside to address their own coastal resiliency. And I would venture to say that the territories are the canary in the coal mine on the issue of rising sea level caused by climate change and the need for coastal resiliency projects. Dr. Diaz, like Puerto Rico and the United States Virgin Islands in 2017, my district, the Northern Mariana Islands, was devastated by a major storm, Super Typhoon U2 in 2008. It was reported to be the most powerful storm in the United States since the 1930s. 2 years later, we're still recovering. And such extreme weather events unfortunately leave coastal communities throughout the country quite vulnerable. So, do you think, Dr. Diaz, that federal coastal habitat and resiliency grants are flexible enough to accommodate the unique needs of communities in the territories? And in your experience, what is the best way to prioritize the time of your planners and engineers uh, to draft proposals and carry out this important work?
So thank you for the question, Congressman. Uh, Definitely, there are great programs that have been made available to us to develop this type of strategies to preventively address coastal hazards and reduce risks. On the NOAA side, I believe that we have been able to get some projects approved, obviously with a one-to-one matching requirement in many cases, or under Section 309 of the Coastal Zone Management Act to do it without matching the requirements. However, those larger funding opportunities associated to FEMA, HUD, CDBG funding, mitigation funding, as well as Army Corps of Engineers, they have benefit cost analysis tools that typically favor uh, rapid return on investment, lower cost initiatives that typically go to the gray side of the equation. So, in order for us to have more resilient, longer lasting, lower operations and maintenance infrastructure in place, we would need to go with hybrid or nature-based options, which are typically not favored by these benefit cost analysis tools. So that's is something that we should continue working on, and I know that there are high-level discussions in this occurring along these lines.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Diaz, and I'd like to work with you some more on this issue because the money the territories get. Well, we're very grateful for that. The help we get are sometimes insufficient to address the problem head on and fix. Thank you, Dr. Diaz. Dr. Bamford, in the aftermath of Super Typhoon Yutu, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation was able to work with community leaders and nonprofit organizations here in the Northern Mariana Islands to provide disaster relief funding from the Emergency Coastal Resilience Fund and the Hurricane Response Marine Debris Removal Funds, totaling more than $10 million. Can you tell us more about how these emergency funds are being used to help communities recover from severe storm damages? And I also would like to echo my interest and support for what Mr. Jennifer Ms. Gonzalez Colon had mentioned about the Stafford Act. Ms. Stafford,
Absolutely.
please.
Thank you so much. So Congress appropriated $50 million in 2019 emergency supplemental appropriations bill to NIFWIF to create what is the Emergency Coastal Resilience Fund. And that was really to improve the resilience of communities heavily impacted by Hurricanes Florence and Michael and Typhoon Yutu, as you clearly know. And similar funds were appropriated to NOAA for the Marine Debris Program to remove debris after these storms, and they signed a cooperative agreement with NIFWIF to manage $20 million of those dollars. Now, when we were soliciting proposals from these impacted areas, we worked with those communities, particularly the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, and hosted specific webinars for underserved and extremely vulnerable communities impacted by these storms to really encourage proposals for restoration grants. These webinars helped guide applicants through the application process. It highlighted goals of the funding. It encouraged them to coordinate, attract partners, leverage other efforts, and look at pilot projects that they would allow them to really build capacity.
Thank you.
So NIFIP was able to really work with communities and make that happen to get those grants there.
Yeah, thank you. And just hearing from the panelists and some of the members themselves ask the questions, it's always more than worth it that I get up at 4 in the morning to join you guys. So I'm still here. Dr. Graves, Mr. Graves, hello, and thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you, Congressman Sablan. And I suspect it's pretty early in the morning in American Samoa as well. So we welcome Congresswoman Radewagen, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank
You're
you.
muted. There you go. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to thank you, Chairman Huffman, for holding this hearing today, and especially want to thank the panel for your testimony. And I too want to express my appreciation to Ms. Napolitano for raising concerns as to whether the territory's needs are being met in terms of a number of the different issues that she brought up. Mr. Diaz, I agree with the general theme running through your testimony that grant programs can be particularly difficult to implement in the territories due to lack of resources. In my own experience, Congress can make every effort to make sure initiatives are fully funded, and yet it can feel like the territories still cannot take advantage of certain programs. And even in situations where matching funds have been waived, we have sometimes found that we can't use everything that is made available. So as it stands, spending money on a problem is only step one. Now, Mr. Diaz, setting aside the issue of matching funds, I'd like to hear more from you about the capacity issues faced by the territories. In your experiences, what are some of the organizational and infrastructure obstacles to obtaining and utilizing grants?
Well, I can specifically talk about the Puerto Rico's case. We are obviously facing a fiscal crisis here for the past 10 years, and government has been shrinking. Retirement has been incentivized. There has been, particularly after the hurricanes, an exodus of brains. People are, seeking better opportunities in the conterminous states. So our capacity is being limited by different forces, and putting together proposals and filling out specific requirements of the federal funding opportunities demand not only the knowledge, because you may have a director or a program chief that knows what needs to be done, but we need a larger number of individuals working on those. It was particularly evident after Hurricane Maria, and I pointed that out in my testimony, that over $61 billion have been authorized by government, by Congress, apologies, but only 16 or 27 billion have been actually awarded. It is because working on the details of completing the applications and then discussing with the federal agency, reviewing each aspect of a detailed project budget, or discussing elements of the benefit cost analysis of certain alternatives. It takes time, it demands a lot of resources, and as you know, our jurisdictions don't have that massive amount of colleagues that could be engaged in this type of issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Radewagen. I believe on the Democratic side, our next member is Mr. Lowenthal. If I've got that wrong, please somebody correct me. No, he's saying no. So I believe then we're going to go to Mr. Levin.
Chairman, I actually think it's Ed Case based on the list, but I'm happy to go.
So you know what? We're going to stick with our Pacific Ocean colleagues here. So it's fairly early for Ed Case too. Let's go to Ed Case for 5 minutes.
Pretty mellow this morning compared to my colleagues. Dr. Bamford, the chair started out the meeting by asking kind of two more specific questions, which had to do with potential statutory changes to adjust to specific challenges with grant making capacity, as well as matching fund requirements. And I wondered if you might just go back to that basic inquiry of the hearing, which is, okay, fine, we've got the situation where you've worked very, very hard to make these programs accessible to many, many communities out there. Many communities, including mine here in Hawaii, are accessing them. Our Sea Grant program here has been in place for decades now and is really an outstanding, part of our efforts to protect our coastal communities and our nearshore marine, especially. We have the estuarine programs that we utilize for protection of coastal resources, restoration of ancient Hawaiian fish ponds, both for historical and cultural purposes, but also directly related to maintenance of nearshore marine. And yet we have the same issues as many other jurisdictions have in terms of some of our smaller organizations not being able to access the grants themselves. And so the need for greater grant making assistance. And then let's get to the matching fund requirement, which has been problematic and is going to be completely acute given COVID-19, when many, many states and other jurisdictions are now having to make a choice between funding immediate state needs that the federal government is not providing for, especially as we thus far failed to deliver a second emergency assistance package for COVID-19. They're going to have to cut off these matching grant funds. Provision has already been made in some cases for waivers for some of the territories from grant contribution matching funds. Do you think that there are statutory changes that need to be made? Either with access to grant making capacity, but I think that's more of a funding issue, but more directly with the matching fund requirements, either as a result of COVID-19 on a temporary basis, and with COVID-19 temporary means years, or on a permanent basis. Dr. Bamford, what's your assessment?
So thank you. So what I can speak to is the experience I've seen here at NIFWF. And I think the biggest thing about match is it needs to be treated more as a competitive criteria than something that disqualifies any project. There is such a diversity of projects out there. Some have no match, some have more match than required. And I think we have to be very nimble and look at not just each project individually, but how we look at the suite of projects to meet those requirements. Now, at NIFWF, because we have a unique model where we have public and private partnerships, we have a lot of flexibility to work with our grantees who might not be able to meet that match. So we kind of look at it across the spectrum, funds that maybe we've raised internally or other sources of funding to really bring them across the finish line. So I think the nimbleness, I think the public-private partnership is really key, and it is a great model. And in addition to that, I think the outreach, we have to get into these communities and really talk to them. What do they need? And, a lot of it is just them being able to put pen to paper in those proposals. And so if we can help get into those communities, work with them, write those applications better, give them the understanding of what would be competitive. And then when it comes to match, have the nimbleness and flexibility through our funding sources to get them across the finish line, even if they don't have the match requirement for that project.
And do the existing statutes and regulations provide for that nimbleness? That's the key question. Is that already in the system, or do you think that it needs to be more flexible?
Well, again, speaking on behalf of NIFWF, because we are we work with public and private funds. We have different requirements on different sources of funds. Some require one-to-one match, some require no match. So it gives us a lot more flexibility within our programs of how we can fund and get through those barriers.
Okay, I'm sorry to stay on this, but you're talking about requirements. Do you think those requirements need to be relaxed in order to give you more flexibility?
For the model that we have, I think the model works well in terms of us being able to select the projects to get to our conservation outcomes. I think we're doing okay.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I yield back.
Thanks, Congressman Case, and sorry for my confusion earlier. Didn't mean to pass you over in the order, but I think on the other side of the aisle, by process of elimination, we are down to Garret Graves of Louisiana to bat cleanup. Congressman Graves, if there's someone else on your side that needs to be recognized, let me know. Otherwise, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all of the witnesses here, and I really appreciate all your testimony. I think it's been important perspective. Mr. Chairman, I will actually want to take a minute or two just to continue kind of from the opening statement. So look, we've got a lot of federal programs right now that invest or potentially invest in our coastal resources. And in some cases, federal rules prevent us from being able to use them in the most efficient manner. And Mr. Chairman, you and again, my friend, Mr. Lowenthal and Ms. Napolitano and others, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, we all worked together in the 2018. You may recall the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and I believe that Mr. Diaz might have been making reference to that earlier. Those funds are used to address vulnerabilities or hazards that our community have, yet federal rules prevented us from being able to use them to build a federally authorized project through the Corps of Engineers, for example, where there's no money for it. In many cases, we have a lot of just rules and policies that don't make sense. I mean, as you know, because we've all experienced frustration there, Corps of Engineers does the most scrutiny from an environmental and economic perspective of anything, of any agency. And to have rules that prohibit you from being able to commingle funds. Look, Ms. Bamford has participated in many of these large-scale projects where we've got billions of dollars in problems and millions of dollars in money. And in some cases, it's money through different agencies. If we can build that puzzle and simply allow for the commingling or the integration of funds, in many cases, we can address a lot of the problems that we're having. And I think that, let me just say on this, I think that one of the issues that we really need to look at is some of the natural resources jurisdiction, the T&I Transportation Committee jurisdiction of these different programs, and figure out how to better utilize and better manage some of these federal resources that are out there. Look, NIFWIF, I've had the opportunity to work with them. They have been a fantastic partner to work with. But one of the things about them that makes them great is that they're not government. And I don't know all the history, and maybe I should, about how they were originated, but they're federally chartered. Congress established them. And one of the reasons that they're great to work with, again, they don't have all the federal bureaucracy. They're an efficient, she said it herself, nimble, agile organization. They are. And in some cases, I think it's our federal rules that were solutions in search of problems that have added to the challenges of bureaucracy. And I think that Ms. Jackson made reference to that. Mr. Chairman, one last thing on this is that the chairman of the Transportation Committee indicated that we're going to work on FEMA or disaster reform. Mr. Diaz and Ms. Gonzalez-Colon have been incredibly frustrated with their inability to get money out the door. This affects our resiliency. It re-victimizes disaster victims. It prevents us from being able to stop or address problems that are out there. And I think there's plenty of us to work on. And Mr. Chairman, none of these things, none of them should be partisan issues. These are things that we should all be coming together on. So I'm hopeful that we can work together to address some of these resiliency issues moving forward. I do want to ask Ms. Bamford, when you work on projects that, for example, you have a corporate partner and it's you're not using Interior or NOAA funds or whatever else, do you have to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act when you're implementing projects using those dollars?
So actually, if it's just private or corporate money, typically not. And the interesting thing we do here is because we're always mixing and mingling. We're not mixing and mingling, but when we're funding proposals, we try to look at different funding sources. So we try to stick with the highest requirements. But no, if it's just a private funder.
And Ms. Bamford, do you destroy the environment in your projects?
No.
Of course not.
I really hope not. I hope not.
Y'all have been great to work with. Again, had a great partnership in Louisiana in the aftermath of oil spill and many other projects. And so, Mr. Chairman, I just think it's noteworthy, and Ms. Jackson talked about this a little bit earlier as well, that there are models out there that I think work much better than normal. Ms. Jackson, than all of these federal bureaucracy that actually prevents progress or is an obstacle. Ms. Jackson, I want to ask you a question. You have a background in accounting. You work for Ernst & Young. Yes. You work for the Ex-Im Bank. You worked for Marriott. You have worked on numerous diversity projects. You've been involved in minority projects and thought leader. I think that background actually makes you a good witness and good perspective for many of these communities that are challenged or victimized by our own government. And I think it's unfortunate the way that you were introduced. And I'd like to just yield my remaining 10 seconds to the chairman to issue an apology, because you under oath were clear that there's no money or dark money or whatever paying you to do this. And I thought that the president's comments were out of line. And I just want to yield my remaining
Well,
time.
I'll take the 10 seconds. Thank you, Congressman Graves. I'll just take the 10 seconds to clarify to the extent that it's needed that I was speaking about the organization Project 21, not about Ms. Jackson individually. And so we'll leave it at that. But the time has expired, and I believe that takes us to Congressman Levin in Southern California, where it's not early. So he has no excuse not to be incredibly sharp for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate very much your bringing us all together for this important hearing. Mr. Diaz, I wanted to start with you. You have a lot of experience, obviously, applying for funds and carrying out coastal projects. Can you tell us more about how federal priorities, such as a quick return on investment, play out at a local level, and specifically how cost-benefit analyses affect which projects get funded and what types of activities get funded?
So, yes, I initiated my testimony discussing that very issue, and we have faced that very frequently. After 1998 in Hurricane Georges, response and recovery efforts, we tried to introduce the use of beach nourishment, berms, dunes, and even repairing coral reefs. However, we were laughed at, but it took until Katrina that FEMA started modifying its attitude towards ecosystem services. Now I think that we're moving closer to what should be the new generation of infrastructure in coastal areas. It's infrastructure that's able to withstand changes, because that's the nature of the coastal dynamics. So rapid return on investment as a decision making in the benefit cost analysis conducted by federal agencies create a problem, because while you select an infrastructure that will perform for 25 or 50 years and has the lowest cost, and with one storm it may pay itself, the sponsor of the project or the jurisdiction that inherits that infrastructure don't have typically the funding for maintenance to repair or to replace. So in our vision, we should invest into infrastructure that can mutate on itself and adapt to future scenarios. And that's the green-gray approach, the hybrid approach of engineering with nature or nature-based options. That I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz. Appreciate that thoughtful response. Dr. Osborne Jelks, I wanted to turn to you. The Committee on Education and Labor released a report last year called Investing in Economic Mobility, the Important Role of Historically Black Colleges and Universities, Tribal Colleges and Universities, and Minority-Serving Institutions in closing racial and wealth gaps in higher education. And the major takeaway from the report was that despite high-quality collegiate experience that encourages students to thrive, HBCUs, TCUs, and MSIs are receiving less state funding and resources than mainstream institutions, and that their faculty, frankly, are doing more with less. I was wondering, Dr. Osborne Jelks, if you could please comment on how this affects both faculty and students at these universities, and specifically how the reduced funding impacts the work, the sense of value, and the mental health of individuals at HBCUs, TCUs, and MSIs.
Thank you so much for your question. It's a very good question, because we really see the impacts on a daily basis of the lack of resources that these institutions receive. I will say that these institutions, whether we're talking about HBCUs, TCUs, or MSIs, are full of innovation. And so it puts faculty and staff sort of into overdrive, I'll say, to try to offer the best possible experiences for our students as we possibly can. But that work could be so, it could be, the reach could be so much greater if there were additional resources that were available. As we think about the pandemic that we are experiencing right now, this is heightened. There's so many challenges that our young people, that our students are facing in their homes. Lots of these institutions have had to do quite a bit to be able to deliver quality distance education to our students. For the institutions that are still doing some things in person, obviously there have been tremendous financial impacts to the way that we have to, operate these institutions now in the midst of this global pandemic. So I will say that it does take a toll on, the mental, on our, it takes a toll on people mentally, but we are resilient. But what I would say is that these inequities with respect to funding have to be addressed, so that it's not up to us to be resilient. The system should be resilient, and the system should be equitable. So whatever can be done, I just, look at reports like the one that you mentioned, look at where the resources have gone, and direct an action plan to make sure that there is more parity in terms of the resources that get to these institutions that are serving communities that are in need, that have so much potential to contribute to our society in positive ways.
Well, thank you. I'm out of time, but appreciate all your excellent work, and we'll yield back to Chairman Huffman.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll now recognize myself to close us out. And I want to say this, President Sharp, you offered some words about the broader issue of climate change, reminding us that these grants are really just Band-Aids in the context of all the things that we need to do to protect coastal communities and frontline communities, communities of color, from all the impacts that are coming at them. I couldn't agree more. So please, I hope no one confuses this hearing with offering a broader suite of solutions to address climate change. We know we've got bigger and more important pieces of this to tackle, but these Band-Aids through the federal grant programs that are within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee are still important for the limited piece of this that they represent. And so I appreciate the chance we've had today to talk about how we might be able to make them work better. We've heard some ideas that would take us outside the jurisdiction of this subcommittee and this committee. Maybe there are ways to work. Congressman Graves mentioned some things that might take us into Corps of Engineers and T&I jurisdiction. I'm happy to consider ways that we can work together with other committees as well. But I think this has been a really useful start for those programs and grant opportunities that are within our jurisdiction. I will close this out, since we're at the end now, with something that my friend Alan Lowenthal does in his subcommittee. He's been able to get concurrence from his ranking member without it counting against anyone's time, to just ask the panel if any of the witnesses wanted to hear a certain question that was not asked, and give them a chance to say what that was and what their answer would have been. I'm trying to get that kind of concurrence and collegiality on this subcommittee. Haven't been able to make it happen yet, but in the spirit of Congressman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar and what they've been able to do on their subcommittee, I'll just use my time to do that same thing here. And so for any of the witnesses that were on our panel, what's a question that you would like to have been asked? And what is your answer? If you could just take about 30 seconds and we'll use that to close us out. Hope I haven't stumped anyone.
So I do have a question that I'd like to put forward. This question was, why are HBCUs and other minority serving institutions so important for building community resilience to climate change? And I'll just simply say that our HBCUs and other minority serving institutions partner with communities every day. In many cases, we are located in these very communities that are facing these climate impacts, the disproportionate climate impacts. And I believe that HBCUs and MSIs are a part of the solution to helping to build the capacity even of the community. So really investing in those types of partnerships, I believe will help us to strengthen our efforts to advance toward climate resilience.
Anyone else?
Yes, sure. This is President Sharp. I would pose the question, how could Congress work more effectively with tribal nations? And my 30-second answer to that would be to directly engage us, to really understand our vision for how we're going to meet the needs of our community, because oftentimes we are forced to consider grants with state requirements and parameters or federal regulations, but we clearly have a tremendous amount of traditional ecological knowledge that we just simply are not able to bring to the table as part of those solutions.
All right.
And
Yes,
I
Ms.
would,
Jackson.
this is Donna
Please.
Jackson. Yes. I would like to add that although my point of view has been noted as fringe, Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson showed support for a pipeline that would bring affordable energy into the Chicago area. And they said that these green New Deal policies should not affect and cause low-income minorities to pay higher energy bills. They said that Black farmers and that low-income people should have the same access to affordable energy. So my opinion is not fringe, because they're civil rights activists, and they said that their first and foremost responsibility is for that of the poor. We should not be making energy costs so high that it becomes a luxury item that only the rich can afford.
Thank you, Ms.
Everybody
Jackson.
should have access.
Dr.
to
Bamford,
basic
did you
needs.
have a question you wish you'd been asked and an answer?
I just want to echo what you said. As various stressors on coastal communities and habitats increase, demand for funding, expertise, and capacity for coastal resiliency is also going to increase. And, at NIFWIF, we try to grant funding to the most dynamic, innovative, and effective proposals. However, we also had to turn down a number of equally qualified projects just because we just don't have enough, even bringing all the partners together. So I really want to echo that we're going to continue to see this need, and we are going to do everything we can to bring as many partners to the table, both public and private, and continue to be as innovative as we can to address these issues in all communities across the U.S.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz?
Well, I won't be asking a question, but I would follow up on what Dr. Bamford just mentioned. More enriching within the federal agencies would be fantastic in order to improve our capacity to address these complex issues that are not an issue of the future. We're facing them right now. So, I just hope that we're able to work on not only a bipartisan base, but also on a multilateral basis with other colleagues across other nations too. Here in the Caribbean, where we face the same issues, so we do have to collaborate, but on a more technical and scientific basis, and not on an institutional, more formal way. So there are opportunities to improve in these areas.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank all the witnesses for the valuable testimony, and the members for their excellent questions. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for witnesses, and we'll ask that you respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit written questions to witnesses within 3 business days following this hearing. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days to allow for responses. If there's no further business before the subcommittee, then without objection, we stand adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.